Why are the recordings from the 60s and 70s so bad? Thomas in Dresden, Germany asks that very question. To me, almost all recordings from the 60s and 70s sound a little bit thin, somewhat washed out, almost like AM radio. That makes it really difficult for me to enjoy those recordings, even if the music is great. I also often have that problem with records from that time which are described as good sounding by others, and I don't get it. With newer recordings, I have the problem less often. Is that a problem of my system, or is it more a change in the way records were produced back then compared to today? I'd really like to know what you think about this. Well, I have to agree, Thomas. I truly do agree with you that most records from the 60s and 70s, with very few exceptions, sounded like crap. I mean, they were just, ugh. And we have to separate out the ones. So way back when we had Mercury, the Mercury Living Presence series, I have a couple of Buddy Hollies from that era that are terrific sounding. I have some Frank Sinatras that are terrific, but those are the exceptions. And one of the reasons I actually even have them is because they are so exceptional. Brazil 66, one of my wife's favorites, was, I don't remember what year that was, but it was around that same era. Sergio Mendes in Brazil 66 on A&M. Great recording, lovely. But for the most part, 60s and 70s music was pretty nasty, and depending on what you listen to. Now, in the 60s and 70s, we didn't have digital, so everything was analog, right? And a lot of companies, recording companies, had simple 2-track Ampex tape recorders, control boards. Typically, sometimes they were solid state, but many times they were tubes. So you'd think that with a really good Ampex, like the kind we used to use at the radio station, like a 300 series Ampex or a 400 series, that was a little later, not too much later, and a decent control board and microphone, you could make a hell of a good recording, and you could. But for whatever reason, they didn't. So most of those recordings were pretty darn bad. One of the things I know is that this was well before, or just at the beginning of multi-track taping. So they had like three-channel recorders and 2-channel recorders, but in the 60s and going into the 70s, only very few studios had 16-track recorders, 4-track recorders. A lot of the Beatles stuff was just at the very, I mean, those are cutting-edge things at Abbey Road where they had a 4-track tape recorder. And they liked to do a lot of, overdubbing and stuff. So you went from tape to tape to tape, and every time you do a generation of tape, you're losing a lot. Plus, let's be honest, the systems of those days sucked. I mean, who knew, right? Imagine, the typical hi-fi in the 1960s was mono. It was at the beginning. I mean, stereo existed certainly, but it was at the beginning. And so, even like my dad's system, he had tweeters over here, and he had a woofer over here, and it made, it was mono. It was a good system, but it was hardly high fidelity. And you had console stereo, so people didn't really pay a lot of attention to quality back then as much as we would today. And you put those same recordings onto a high-performance audio system, and it sounds pretty bad. A lot of times, a lot of those engineers, we had holdovers from the 40s and the 50s and the 60s still working in the industry. For whatever reason, they didn't like bass. I mean, they would lop the bass off. And that's why they sound thin. You go back and listen to a lot of these recordings, it was like standard practice, since car radios and stereos didn't go much below, 40, 50 hertz, maybe? All that takes room on, all the low frequencies take room on an album. So one of the things they can do is they lop off the bass, and you can put much more information on an album. And of course, everything was albums or tape. There were no CDs back then. So there was plenty of good engineering reasons why we didn't like bass. It took up room on the things, and it was just not our practice. We connected everything up with matching transformers that didn't pay a lot of attention to bass. There was not much low end back then. All these 600, I could go on forever, but the art of recording paid very little attention to sound quality back then, and that's why you hear all this. And then, frankly, there wasn't much bass, so they sound very thin. So you're hearing correctly, and it's a shame. Someday, I've had a pet project for a long time where I'd like to be able to take those recordings and fix them. It is possible. It really is. And I have an idea how we might just do that. Talk to you later. Bye.